Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everyone, here on Big Blend Radio today. I think this is going on a number of our podcast channels, our Way Back When History, Eat, Drink, and Be Merry show. We're going to be talking about bootlegging history in Kansas, especially Southeast Kansas. So a few weeks ago, we had Phyllis on the show. Phyllis Bitner is from the Miners Hall Museum Foundation. She's a chair of it. And the Miners Hall Museum is in Franklin, Kansas, which is in Southeast Kansas. Now, we've talked to Phyllis before a couple years ago, and then she came back on a podcast because of our Jefferson Highway podcast that we do and special guide. In fact, as this airs today, which is National Bootleggers Day, this is amazing, right? June 5th is National Bootleggers Day. We are actually at the Jefferson Highway Conference in McAlester, Oklahoma. So we're actually hanging out in person with Phyllis today, right, Phyllis? That we haven't met each other, but we'll be with each other when this airs, right? It's pretty amazing.
Looking forward to it.
I love this. So we did a podcast with Phyllis talking about the museum and the coal mining history of Franklin. It's a very small community, a community that's also been affected by a devastating tornado, but the community and surrounding areas rallied up together. The community is still going. And you go to the museum, you're going to learn so much about the different people that came to Franklin to mine. As I remember, I've been telling people about the podcast with Phyllis, and Phyllis was saying back in the day, there were ads going out to Europe telling people there's gold lining the streets, right, Phyllis, for people to entice people to come and mine in the coal mines, right?
Yes, they said the streets are paved with gold. Come to Southeast Kansas for this wonderful life. And it was not quite like they painted that picture. It was really a very hard life for them working in the coal mining industry.
Oh, wow. I can only imagine how much work has gone on. And by the way, sorry, it's not National Bootleggers Day. It's National Moonshine Day. But it's all connected. And what's really funny is right now, as we record this, we're in Asheville, North Carolina, which is famous for actually running the shine. And how we got NASCAR, I believe, was the bootleggers running the cars as fast as they could. So we're all kind of connected in some way, but we have a special guest that Phyllis said we've got to have on the podcast. Author Ken Peek is joining us, Kenneth J. Peek. And he was, a police officer in Pittsburgh, Kansas, not far from where Phyllis is. And so, I'm just hoping he doesn't arrest any of us right now, but he's been, associated in police force and police work, and also an assistant professor at Wichita State University. And his books out that you can get at the museum and on Amazon, all those places, are Kansas Bootleggers and Kansas Temperance. I don't like the word temperance, but apparently it was needed at some point. I still don't like it. But anyway, welcome to the show, Ken. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and welcome to you, to Phyllis. Both. Very pleased to be part of this. Would you like for me to begin by talking about how this all developed, these books?
Yeah, tell it. Well, isn't it? I just wanted to kind of touch base on, I want to go into your books, but also like that whole history of moonshining and bootlegging, where that started. Can you touch on that a little bit and then get into your books just for people to understand? It's like we're moving to Franklin. The streets are paved in gold, but then we needed to get into bootlegging, right? And moonshining.
It's all intertwined. 1980, a professor of history at Emporia University came out to where I was teaching, State University in Kansas, wanting to know why nothing had ever been written about bootlegging in Southeast Kansas, particularly Crawford County. Now, that's where we're going to be focusing here today, down the corner. Well, someone sent him to me, and Phyllis would confirm. People who grew up there, like Phyllis and myself, hearing about bootlegging and the coal mining days, and my grandfather and his father, great-grandfather, both worked in the coal mines, and we learned about, World War I and World War II and again, bootlegging. And so someone sent him to me, and having that interest and background, I decided that he and I hatched a plot whereby we would work to try to put a book together. So my job was to interview people living in Crawford County about former bootleggers. I interviewed 35 people who were in their 70s at the time. This was in 1983. None of them would give their names for the record, still afraid of the long arm of the law. My co-author, Pat O'Brien, interviewed 6. So we interviewed a total of 41 people, lots of hours in newspaper microfilm, and lots of hours going through court records, state archives, and so forth. In the process of doing that, then, I uncovered the fact that there was a tremendous amount of strong objection to the whole liquor issue, and that led to 7 years later a temperance book, and that's a whole different thing. We'll kind of, I'll allude to it a little bit, but it's a little bit of a separate issue. But they are again linked together too. You can't talk about one without the other. I might also begin then by saying that if you want to understand the history of Kansas liquor and temperance, you have to go back prior to its statehood. Kansas entered the Union in January 1861. What was at the end of about a 10-year period called Bleeding Kansas, and there have been books written by that name. It was a violent. There were violent confrontations, and it all revolved around whether or not Kansas would come into the Union as a slave state or a free state. And so there was, again, a lot of violence connected with that. Also, prior to statehood, 1861, roughly 10,000 Indians of various tribes came to Kansas due to the Indian Removal Act. And then in 1862, after Kansas had been admitted for a year, there was the 1862 Homestead Act, and then we had the end of the Civil War. So all of that brings people to Kansas, and many of them became farmers. Many were military veterans coming back from the war. Kansas population grew by about 240% from 1860 to 1870. And of course, that gamblers and prostitutes, and the fact saloons were cropping up everywhere. And there was just a lot of misery caused by intoxicating liquor from the beginning of state. Kansas, the lines were drawn. Kansas sorely needed a satisfactory liquor law. So that's how kind of the genesis of the whole thing. And we got, of course, at this time, numerous temperance organizations cropping up around the state. Remember that Kansas, and we're talking about Bible meetings, camp meetings that had 6, 7, 8,000 people attending. The liquor problem was, of course, especially difficult on women and children because liquor was ubiquitous and domestically and so forth. All right, so in 1880, this enacted in its state constitution, not just a law, in a state constitution, an amendment, we'll just call it prohibitory liquor law. And Kansas would have that constitutional amendment in effect until 1948, which means then for 68 years, it was illegal to manufacture, possess, or sell intoxicating liquor. One might think that Kansas was the nation's driest state, given that constitutional amendment, but make no mistake, there was never any issue that divided Kansas longer and more fiercely than alcohol.
Can I just quickly go back to, this is all like Kansas doing this and it's doing the temperance law, but is this a different time? Just because my brain and timelines get wonky, and I haven't had any moonshine, I swear, but when you look at it, is this because we nationally went into Prohibition, right? So is the temperance of Kansas now complete? Because you were saying this is a state law. This was completely separate from our national.
Yeah, good point. Well, this is a constitutional amendment, and that's a lot more. You got to have a 2/3 majority in both houses, and it was in 1880, and national prohibition didn't come into effect until 1920. So we're talking 30 years ahead of national prohibition.
Wow.
Kansas said we want to be dry in law, but not in practice. Okay, and that's what spurs the whole bootlegging thing. So now the law said that liquor could only be sold by drugstore. You had to have a prescription. Some physician had to prescribe alcohol for some sort of a condition that the person was supposedly suffering from. So people, of course, had prescriptions for everything under the sun. Liquor was soon prescribed, and there were official liquor prescriptions forms to be filled out, very officious looking. But people were getting booze prescribed to them at the drugstore for indigestion, cancer, snake bites, colic, malaria, rheumatism, diarrhea. One outlet in Texas issued alcohol to treat a nun's hysteria, suppress her carnal thoughts. So
Wow.
lots of prescriptions for booze.
Okay, so go to now. Can we just go to now, like how marijuana got legalized for prescription basis across the country? It was like for medical reasons, like you can, I hurt my knee. I need marijuana now, and you can get a prescription in certain states. It's kind of the similar way to start pushing towards complete legalization, right? In a way.
Yeah.
Ooh,
and I'm going to cover that later. Now, by the way, there was one Topeka drugstore in the early 1900s that sold in 1 month $1,400 in alcohol through prescriptions, which is equal to about $47,000 now. That's in 1 month.
Wow.
So due to obvious, we're going to talk about the marijuana, the drug linkage here in a little bit then, Lisa, okay?
Okay.
So due to obvious abuses, the Kansas legislature stopped the sales of prescriptions and whatnot by druggists in 1909, but that meant there were about 30 years worth of profits for them. Now, we have to begin talking about immigration from Western and Southern. Yes, and Phyllis has talked about this, but Crawford County was again, my grandfather, great-grandfather, everybody mined coal. It was a place to get work. Very dangerous, very dirty, but it was where people could get work. We had people from Italy come. They come to Crawford County, I'm told, people themselves. They spoke no English. They wore wooden shoes, many of them. It was very dangerous work again. There were explosions all around the county. And this is really how, kind of, again, another genesis, you might say, another beginning. The onset of bootlegging was when Dad, the head of the family, might have gotten injured or killed in a coal mine. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they just simply had bad farming years and needed. I want to strongly emphasize, in that time, in the early 1900s and all the way through for several decades, there were no welfare programs. There were no aid to dependent children programs. You had to make a living, and you had a family to raise and all of that. So many people, when times were hard, immigrants and native-born people, turned to bootlegging to try to make a little extra money. So trainloads of people came up from the South, so there was a lot of crime and violence in some of these mining camps. I'm sure Phyllis maybe talked about some of that. Now, right next door to the south of Crawford County is Cherokee County, and there they had lead and zinc mines. They're taking out 500,000 pounds of lead a week there, and your people are living in tents they're throwing up or whatever, and lots of alcohol going on there, alcohol problems. If you watch the series Deadwood or Paint Your Wagon or one of those old movies, probably pretty close to the way things were down there. So when times were hard, a lot of people could soften their misery, perhaps, ease their pain from the hard work, or times got hard, they just reverted back to their, quote, old country culture, language, food, religion, and consumption of alcohol. And again, we're going to get in later, 1920, 1930, Prohibition in the entire nation. People turned to making moonshine.
And this included women too. This included women, not just men, right? Women would do it.
Yes, there were some women who were very well known in Crawford County, and I could take you to where some of them operated.
Okay.
So the old thing was that there are 104 back then, 104 counties in Kansas plus Crawford County. Crawford County was an outlier, and that was because of the number of stills that were operating illegally and so forth. Now, bear in mind too, liquor was cheap and easy to make. It was pretty. Again, it tasted better than water. Many people. Water often tasted like lead. There, it didn't spoil like milk, and it was a lot cheaper than tea or wine. So it became the drink of choice for many people. The first person I interviewed of my was a fellow who was considered to be a superstar in that arena, considered by everybody, all of his peers. And he drew his, and you're going to have a picture that was dressed up a bit. He dictated while I was in the kitchen. He dictated to his son how to draw this still, and so he put it down on a piece of legal pad, and then I took it and had it drawn up a little better so it was understandable. My co-author, Dr. O'Brien, said, "Well, I don't know that this will work. We better have it checked out." So he took it to his chemistry department at Emporia State University. Well, after I got a hold of him, I said, "Well, did it ever come back from chemistry?" And he said, "They told me that recipe will make, quote, damn fine moonshine." Obviously. Again, all these people, a lot of them, they learned early on that the same amount of corn that sold for a few dollars at a market could bring in a couple $100 if you mashed it and fermented it and distilled it. And bear in mind too that, again, saloons were cropping up all over southeast Kansas, particularly Crawford County. Remembering that you could open a saloon by using two 55-gallon barrel drums and a wooden plank, and you had your own saloon. We know that in 1 week in 1908 there were 40 in Crawford County, so that gives some idea of the number of stills that were operating there. Now
that's pretty big for back then. Like to do a raid like that and get that much. We're not in cop cars, normal cop cars that we have today with GPS and stuff and all the technical things we have. So when we think about that kind of raid getting that much, that's pretty big. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Now, a little sidebar here. At about the same time, everything was booze was beginning to flourish in southeast Kansas. We had this so-called Kansas. Most of you have heard of her. She got quite a widespread reputation over today. It was originally C-A-R-R-I, but she changed it to C-A-R-R-Y in 1903. She was born in Kentucky. At age 21, she married a young doctor who took to the bottle, and he died 2 years later. In 1874, she married a lawyer, David Nick. They lived in Texas for a while, moved to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, which is kind of south central. She suffered again from the evils of the ravages of alcohol because of this second husband. And it's been said in the book that it was about that point in time when they were in Medicine Lodge that she, quote, became a little mad. And in the spring of 1900, she began making her agitations, they were called, and buggy to outlying counties and start going into saloons and smashing the places up with her hatchet and rocks and bricks. Oh. And eventually, she had quite a band of women who went with her. Again, the women were suffering in particular from the booze. Spent a lot of time and occasions in jail. Girard, Kansas, the county seat of Crawford County, a few times to speak there. Organizations cropping up all over, trying to with the wets. You got the dries versus the wets. Now let me talk a little what I found out during these interviews. You could go to Chicago, and I heard from several of those people I interviewed that moonshine from Crawford County traveled to Chicago. Supposedly, you could go and knock on the speakeasy door, and if they were going to let you in, they'd ask you what kind of booze you want. Do you want Deep Shaft or 50 Camp or Corona Rye or whatever? Those were some of the nicknames of the booze down there. Several people told me, and I don't. Al Capone, I was never told that Al Capone came personally down from Chicago, but I was told by several people that his people down from Chicago to take Crawford County moonshine up to Chicago to sell in his establishments. Now, let me digress for a second again. A gentleman called me, a retired FBI agent who'd worked organized crime, called me and he said, "Ken, I've come across your Kansas Bootleggers book, and I'm doing research on the Black Hand, and I wonder if, during the course of your interviews, if you came across to the Black Hand." Well,
I said, no. Now, let me explain what that is, because most people probably won't understand it. But Mom and Pop had a grocery store back then. One day, a thuggish-looking person might walk in and say, well, gee, if you want your place to be safe and prosper, you're going to have to pay me some quote protection money every week or every month, whatever. And so they did, or they chose not to. If they chose not to, or they stopped paying, and one day they would go to their grocery store, someone would have taken their hand and dipped it in coal dust, coal being everywhere, dipped it in coal dust and made an imprint on the premises, particularly on you, on the front door. And that was the final warning. You had better pay up or something bad is going to happen.
Oh, it's like the raven is coming. Yeah. Like, oh.
Yeah. And so I'm happy to report, though, that no one I talked to mentioned that the Black Hand. Nobody got their knees shot or business blown up or whatever. I just told him. I told that retired agent that I think I'm just too poor down there. People are just trying to eke out a living. And I might point out now that all these bootleggers I talked to said, we didn't make any money to speak of. We spent it on
food,
fines, bailing out our friends out of jail, or, just trying to eke out a living. And it's not like it's been romanticized, as you said earlier. It's not a money-making thing. Now, let me talk about pandering. Pandering is making things available, so satisfying a need for something. I talked to a hardware store owner. He's very well known in the area in Crawford County, actually out of Pittsburgh, Kansas. Everything you need. Here it is. It's illegal for 68 years to make, sell, transport intoxicating liquor. But you can walk. His hardware store, and off in the corner was everything you needed to set up your still. They had alcohol testers. They had those coils. Everybody's seen those coils running from barrel to barrel. You had charcoal-lined barrels that would give it that 20-year-old Jack Daniel's color. You had electric needles. They could zap this crystal clear moonshine and give it that darkish color again. So it's kind of like, as I mentioned a while ago, if you jump ahead 75 years in the drug, with the head shops, that kind of thing, capitalism at its best. The product is illegal, but we allow people to sell it, to profit from it. And so it was really no problem to go buy all the hardware you needed to set up your still. Also, there was a lot of, I get into trouble, either the feds or the state or local cops nail me. It's just like the drug, and I was a cop for, to put it all together, about 8 years. Okay, we'll take it easy on you if you, quote, roll over or snitch on some of your friends, tell us. And that's what happened a lot with bootlegging, and people got in trouble, so they would give up their friends and neighbors to avoid a lot of trouble. Again, what some of the interviewers told me that kind of stuck out, I'm sitting interviewing one fellow, older gentleman, and he pointed to the house next door. He said, that's our old home place. And he said, we had a still in the basement, and below that was a sub-basement, so we had to still our wares. He said, Harry Truman used to come over from Lamar, Missouri, and buy alcohol from my mom and dad. Now, Harry Truman, he grew up pretty much, I don't know his history terribly well, but he was from Lamar, Missouri, which is about 15 miles east of where we were sitting. And did it happen or not? I have no reason at all to doubt this gentleman. But before Harry got rich and famous, he might well have made the journey over. Another woman who was a nurse told me that, and there was a huge still, gigantic huge in Corona, kind of in southwest county, gigantic operation, lots of explosions. She and her husband would be met at the end of a lane by armed guard trucks, guards with shotguns riding on the running board, and they would escort the doctor and his nurse wife into the still operation, and they would take payment in meat and produce, and they always paid with a wad of money that was placed inside a handkerchief. Just things like that kind of stuck out. Lots of information about one fellow, very common, like I can't even begin to replicate how he told the story. But, I mentioned corn mash a while ago. People being so poor, he said, we'd run a batch of moonshine and throw what was left over, the corn mash, out for the animals. And he said, well, you got horses and cattle and pigs and chickens. They'd all get into that stuff, and the pigs couldn't oint. The cows would fall down and flop all around. The pigs would just grunt, and the horses would flop all around. Everything on the place was intoxicated.
Oh my gosh!
So,
wow! But that's what's interesting about how it happens with the farms and everything. Kentucky's bourbon country. I mean, it was people that started it out of necessity, and they became known for bourbon and barbecue. And the barbecue came because they had so much off-run of water from the bourbon. When you do the mash and everything, and then there was this off-run, so they were creating their own swamps. And so pigs could handle all that. And so the pigs would go in, eat the leftovers, be in the swampy parts. And that's how they ended up with bourbon and barbecue in Kentucky. It's quite fascinating to me how things happen in history like that, Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Now, let me talk about enforcement a little bit here.
I don't want to be enforced. I'm scared.
I was on the interviewing trail, and the word was getting around, and I got a call one day from a woman who lived maybe 15 miles away from where I lived at the time. And she said, I understand you're doing interviews for a bootlegging book. And I said, yes, I am. She said, well, my dad was county sheriff during all that time. I have some photographs. Anybody who's a historian, and I'm not 100%, I'm kind of accidental historian, but, that's the mother lode. She gets boxes full of photographs to a lot of people who were talking about enforcement, who were on the tape. This fellow, the sheriff, her dad was on the tape. Everybody I talked to, she didn't mention it, of course. Several people I talked to, without asking, volunteered the sheriff so-and-so was on the take. When he went into office, he was dirt poor. When he came out a couple terms later, he was pretty well to do and owned a couple farms. Well, but I did get a lot of good photographs. And again, you had to, if you're in law enforcement at the time, you had to kind of convince people you're doing your job, that everything's on the up and up. So they would occasionally parade out a bunch of stills with hatchet cuts in them out in front of the jail, take a picture, 10 people line up, and they would here we're showing the public that we're doing our job, we're enforcing the law. But really, that was a facade. It was a ruse. Even my dad knew one of the county attorneys back when, and his nickname was $5 a barrel Joe, I'll call him. I don't want to mention anybody's real name, but in other words, for $5 a barrel per month or whatever, and you're going back 100 years, then he'd leave you alone. Make sure you didn't get bothered if you're a bootlegger. There were some people who were going around raiding stills. They would get paid a bounty per arrest and so forth. Also, let me say that I spent a couple hundred hours looking through district court records, and gosh, I'm opening up these gigantic ledger books, and here are John Doe search warrants and arrest warrants and falling out on the floor. And back then, in those days, it was quite a lot different. The search warrant might say, okay, go to the third house that's north of this corner or whatever, and go kick in the doors or something like that. It might be Jane Doe, John Roe, or Richard Roe, whatever. They wouldn't even know people's names or address. Just go to this house and kick down the door or make the arrest or whatever. But looking at enforcement, as I mentioned, the payoffs to sheriffs, prosecutors, judges, and by the way, speaking of judges, what I learned going through those huge, many, many years of ledger books, court records, was that it was not unusual to find a case being continued 50 to 100 times. 50 to 100 times. Well, somebody getting paid off, or maybe some judges really feeling sorry for somebody, who knows, but it was just mind blowing to see how many times a case could be continued. Missouri was always a thorn in the side of Kansas, because people could drive where I lived, go just a few miles, and Missouri was pretty wet. You go over there and even for many years go over there on Sunday and buy your Sunday booze and bring it back to Kansas.
It's still the same between Kansas City, Kansas versus Kansas City, Missouri, like where you can buy wine. You can't even buy wine in a grocery store. You can get like 3% beer in a grocery store. But if you have wine, you have to go to a liquor store or cross over the county line. It's interest or the state line, I should say. It's still like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
But a lot of things frustrated enforcement. Another thing was, people got pretty smart in terms of where to hide their booze. And, of course, that the whole coal mining occupation made these gigantic strip pits, and that afforded bootleggers, still operators, a good water and places to hide their stills and so forth. We had one guy was very inventive. He had a little corral inside a small shed or a little barn, the meanest Shetland pony in the world, and he had a corn crib in there with that pony, and that's where he hid all of his booze. So if any of the enforcement people went in there, they get nailed by the Shetland pony.
The Shetland pony. Well, I'm just going to say Shetland ponies, just for the record, are all like that. All of them. They look very cute until you try to ride them, and I've been stomped on by one of them. No, stay away from the Shetland ponies.
Sure, dozens of ways of hiding. The way was to remove you got a fence, remove the post out of the ground, dig it down a couple, 3 or 4 more feet down, and then you can stick your jugs of hooch in the hole in the ground, and then put the post back on top of it. That was another thing I should mention. That was were loopholes in the law. At first, it was Kansas had trouble defining what alcohol was. How do you define what alcohol really is? Well, so some restaurants and outlets such as that would serve cider. Well, cider was 13% alcohol at times, and one guy, Billings, he was a famous humorist back in the late 1800s. He said, "Cider may be a good temperance drink, but I can get so drunk on it that I can't tell one of the 10 commandments from a bylaw in a baseball book." So that's what he had to say. We had prickly ash bitters, Jamaica, all kinds of things that came out and trying to get around the law again, but they were very intoxicating. So after years of struggles, the Kansas statute kind of defined what alcohol. Another problem was that, there were probably at least a half dozen cases brought to the court where people tried to skirt around the law. So I opened a social club where people bring their own booze to be dispensed by the bartender. Is that an illegal saloon? I take my at the drugstore. Well, the court said, that you're guilty. You can't do that. Here's another guy had a cigar store in the front and a saloon operating in the back. It was proven that he knew about the saloon in the back, so he's guilty. Is it illegal to sell a drunk, someone who's visibly drunk, obviously drunk, continue to serve them booze, and then he goes home and abuses the family or whatever? So they had to deal with all those kinds of things. We had out-of-state railroads delivering liquor into Kansas, again, which is dry. And the railroads are arguing, we didn't know what it was for. Well, yes, you got to know what all this huge amount of booze is for. You're guilty. So just those kinds of things that people tried to say. That you also have a picture, by the way, Lisa. I interviewed an insurance salesman, very prominent fellow in the area. His father was a deputy sheriff, and he had been pretty aggressive enforcing the liquor laws. You've got a picture of, the entire family is asleep in one part of the home, and that night somebody snuck up and basically dynamited the house, and they took off the whole portion of the house. You've got that photo again. No one was injured. It was a message loud and clear. You better back off. It's kind of like the Black Hand kind of operation. And I found his dad whacked in the head with a hatchet during a raid about a week before the dynamiting incident. So,
wow. Yeah, it's fascinating to me because, the prohibition part of it. And, if you think about what alcohol was like then versus now, when you go to a store, you can see the percentage of alcohol. You can see, this is like way high, this is low. And I didn't understand all that. I didn't, I just, I didn't know. But like grocery stores in Kansas, Colorado is different too. Colorado's got some interesting laws, and it's about percentage of the beer. Now, if you go to a liquor store and buy beer, like sometimes you can go to a liquor store in certain places and you can't buy beer or wine. You have to go here for that. It's just crazy how it all works across the country.
Yeah.
Nancy and I like our wine. You know, it's always interesting about where we can buy our wine as we travel across the country, but it's this percentage of liquor, because I've never looked at the percentage until like all these laws as we travel. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even look at, we like this wine. I didn't know, maybe we like it more because of the higher percentage. I don't know. But isn't back in the day, they weren't playing percentage of alcohol, were they, that much? I think it was like you could be having 100 proof and going through the roof a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, this first person, going back to the first person I interviewed who was a superstar, he made the very best stuff. There were people very nefarious, I guess, wicked people, greedy people who would make moonshine, and they would take, Phyllis is very aware of this, take carbide out of a coal miner's lamp, throw that into the moonshine. That gives it some color, some look of age, but and they would things such as that, and the bathtub gin, you can read about that. Some of that stuff that people made, I don't think it ever happened in Crawford County, but up in Chicago and various areas, it would make people go blind. Some of the ingredients they put into it, it's just toxic. It could kill people or certainly harm them to no end. But that's another aspect of this, sort of like the drug thing. We know people have laced drugs and do various things with that. I want to emphasize too. To me, this pretty much personifies bootleg. And I heard this story in different forms, one way or another. And again, I've got prison commitment orders falling out of the ledger books on the floor and various things. So imagine that you and your spouse are farming and trying to eke out a living for 3 or 4 kids, and a neighbor snitches because you got to steal. So here come the feds or state, whatever, and they come to you and they say, we don't care who goes to prison, but somebody has got to go for a year a day. Well, think about it. Who's going to go to prison for a day? No kids or no, got to be adult. Well, guess what? Dad's got to stay home and keep the farm going, and Mom maybe keep the again. Mom goes to the so-called chicken farm, and I've seen these orders, and I think there's a copy of one in my book. The so-called chicken farm in Lansing, Kansas, for a year and a day. Now maybe hopefully time off for good, whatever. So that pretty much tells you how it was, and I got a quote from a district judge in Fort Scott, Bourbon County, right next door to Crawford County. Quote, I'm getting tired of business. Why they continue to engage in the violation of this law, I can't understand. There's no money in it. Some years ago, a liquor man was in this court. He told me that during the few years he was in the business, he had paid to the city of Fort Scott, that's about $85,000 today. He had to hire lawyers to defend him. He bribed witnesses and silenced tongues until there was nothing left for him. He said he would be better off if they would simply compel him to quit business. So, again, there you have a couple of anecdotes about how it was. And, the industrial farm for women. I've got picture of that commitment order in my book, and and again that bleeds into the whole temperance thing and temperance organizations and women trying to bring a halt to this, or at least bring it into rein it in to where it's not so harmful to the. I don't know that was ever possible, but again, it was just too easy to make the stuff, too easy to set up a saloon, too easy to buy your equipment, set up a still, and try to make a living. So, as the it may have been illegal, but it wasn't wrong. Like, it may have been, it wasn't wrong. So, that's the story.
In Kansas, but like when I think about where we are in North Carolina right now, and how they did the bootlegging and the driving, and it actually helped form NASCAR, and the connection to Kansas. It's not, to me, it's not that far, but there's just this incredible history of roots And Jefferson Highway, like you were talking also about Fort Scott, that's part of the Jefferson Highway. Highways become places from ancient times. Maybe it's a royal road from the Native Americans and ancestral people, indigenous people, or the Spanish even coming through, depending on where. Cattle roads, right? Cattle routes. Kansas is part of that, going through to Texas. And Jefferson Highway, to me, once these routes become something, everybody starts to use them and gets to know them of when you can or cannot do it. Kansas, this is so fascinating because Kansas, the history of Kansas to me is, and its connection with Missouri, those two states being connected, it's like a hotbed of history of like even the Civil War, and what happened in the Civil War between those two states was interesting. I think it's because it is truly in the heartland that it's so fascinating. I can, because you're in Reno and you're based out of Reno right now, Nevada. We've done a lot of coverage on a community, and this actually goes back to the Jefferson Highway. So Route 66, actually, not Route 66, excuse me, the Pony Express Trail goes from Carson City and it goes from California all the way across to Joplin, Missouri. Or is it St. Joseph? I'm going to get one of them wrong here. But anyway, it goes to Missouri. Yerington, Nevada is part of the Pony Express Trail, and it has a fort there and everything. Yerington, Nevada, it's just a little east of Carson. It's not far from you, maybe a couple, 2 to 3 hours, if that. And Yerington, Nevada is a small mining town, and it's got wildlife areas. It's actually the biggest geocaching place in the world. It's got over 14,000 geocaches if people listening geocache. And it's in the shape of an eagle if you look from the sky down. But anyway, this town changed its name 3 times. It was Yerington. Yeah. Now it's Yerington because they wanted the railroads to go to their town. So they named their town after the railroad dude, the big guy. And he never even bothered to set foot, and they never got the railroad. They got the mining, and it's also the Native American history of the Paiutes is very fascinating out there with the ghost dancer. And anyway, that's a whole other story, whole other podcast, but they changed their names 3 times. And at one time, because it was a mining town, it was called Pison Switch, which is poison switch, but Pison. And you've got a bunch of immigrant people coming in, very similar to, what we were talking about, Phyllis. Here's all these people coming in thinking, hey, we're going to make it. Our families will have food on the table. We're going to work hard, be able to live well, right? Same thing. Well, Pison Switch came because of the people coming in selling whiskey, and they were putting tobacco in there. They were putting everything in there, and it tasted so bad that, and it was poisonous. It wasn't actually real, like moonshine. Like, I think, going from the Midwest over, like it started to get a little bit better. And, depending on who was making it, there was actually alcohol involved. They were throwing all kinds of stuff. And that's how they got the name Pison Switch, is because they switched the liquor to poison, basically. And then they became Greenfield or Greenville because it's so lush and green in the spring and summer. And then they changed their name to Yerington. So they had 3 names, that town. Isn't that wild? I mean, this history is rampant through our country, but I think, Phyllis, does a lot of this really come from actually the roots of it being, like when you look at Franklin and Southeast Kansas, the roots of being, hey, we want everyone to come over here and work in this area. I'm going back to the streets lined in gold, paved in gold, and bringing people over. And it wasn't really what they thought, right? When they got to their new home, I should say.
Exactly. And many of them had large families. They didn't make that much money working in the coal mines. They lived in little tiny coal mining houses. And I mean tiny. They were 3 or 4 room houses. They had 6 or 8 children, and they just had to figure out a way to make money to provide for that family. So that really is, I think, where in that era, that was where the bootlegging began. They all knew how to make bootleg, whatever you want to call it, moonshine. And they did it to support their families, is basically what they did, because the streets were not paved in gold.
Yeah,
I have in my notes, I might point out my notes that in the early 1900s, Crawford County alone had about 290 mines in that area. That's from a book by a good friend of mine, Dr. William Powell. 290 mines, and a lot of people. Well, my grandfather, I know. Again, his father mined coal. My grandfather left. He left in like the third or fourth grade to go work in the coal mines, and everything he made was turned over to his parents. That's just the way it was. And yes, you got a lot of injuries and deaths and explosions and all those kinds of things. So again, it's all hand in glove. Coal mining, bootlegging, all of that, and temperance fits together.
I think bootlegging,
exactly.
Bootlegging, mining, and family, but family was the crux of everything. And you've got to think about, moving over to a new country. We're not getting on a Boeing jet here. Just the hardship of them even. Listen, by the time they even land in America, like, I want some moonshine. Are you kidding me? You're going to put me on this crazy ship that's like not like a nice cruise liner. It's not Princess Cruises. By the time I get to the States, I want some moonshine. I'm going to make some hooch just for me. So I think part of it too is like, hey, it's, there's a thing with that where people just need to have a break. The market is there because it's so hard, and it's so hard that they need a break. And that's where the hooch comes in.
And it was just a part of their life. It was very common. It wasn't like it was, just one person here or there. It was just a common part. So at our museum where we tell that coal mining story, we are telling the story of the immigrants when they came, from the time they came to this country all the way through. And one of our sections is the bootlegging and the winemaking. It was just an everyday part of life for almost, a large percentage of the families. We tell about their social life, their education, their religious life, all the things the immigrants did or how they lived when they came here. And like I say, the bootlegging story was just a very common part of everyone's life.
I love it. I love that you're sharing that. And I also think it's really important, Ken, with what you've done with your books. And thank you for joining us today. We're getting people the full story of why temperance happened, in Kansas and then globally, like nationally, not globally. And, it's just, there's a history to it. And it is not like, we talked about it, before we recorded about, it's such a romantic thing. He's a bootlegger. He's a this and that. Or she, there's so many moonshiners and bootleggers that are women. And then, like you're saying, women having to go to prison or to jail, for that year and one day because of the circumstance of who's going to bring the money and the food in and run the farm. So it's so complex. And so I think sometimes, movies are great. It gets us interested in something. But when you really learn the stories, and this is why books like what you've written, Ken, and going to museums and actually going to the places and hearing the real true stories are so important. So I hope people understand that part of it. But now I do want to go have some moonshine. But last time I tasted moonshine, I can't do a podcast if I do any moonshine.
Well, let me throw this in. The Prohibition has been called the noble experiment that failed. It did end in January of 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment because of public backlash and organized crime, of course, was becoming more powerful during Prohibition, lack of enforcement. But I think the big reason, and you just sort of alluded to it, the big reason it failed is Americans love alcohol. And yes, people from Europe love alcohol. And I found, you can Google it, average American age 14 and older consumes the equivalent of 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol per year. That's, of course, in wine and all kinds of things. So we do like our alcohol. And again, the noble experiment was doomed to fail, you might say.
Yeah. And it's a European thing, but if you even in the world of animals, some animals get drunk on rotten fruit, including bats, by the way. Some of them like to have some. Yep, it's really true. It's about the sugars and the fermentation. I've seen elephants when we lived in Africa. In Kenya, there was one elephant who would know when the citrus was overripe, and he would have those and get a little buzz. And it was fun to watch. But I think it's an escape. And many cultures have used some form of escape, whether it's peyote or, when you look at the history of alcohol, and I interviewed a professor on this history of wine and the oldest wine. And honestly, they've now found remnants of something similar to marijuana and wine way, way back in Roman times. Like it was being done, centuries ago. So we have, as humans, we want that escape thing, and the animals do. So I don't know where we land on it all now. It's very interesting when we're talking about the marijuana side, because then things do become legal, and then the people that were growing it illegally get mad at what's legal. Yet then the people doing it legally are mad because they're paying taxes, and such huge taxes. So it's kind of interesting what's going on to me. I look at it all, go, well, that's interesting, So we always repeat history, don't we? As we do. But listen, no one's taking my wine away from me. I want my wine. That's always going to happen. It's part of my blood and my DNA, my genealogy, and my family history. I will always have my glass of wine at the end of the day. Thank you very much. So I'm just saying, but thank you both so much. Phyllis, you are just amazing. We can't wait. We're going to do another special show for Labor Day talking about the Amazon March out in Franklin and your area. Are in the headquarters of these women of, immigrant women getting together with their pots and pans, maybe some that help some moonshine along, like, something was in there, marching for their husbands and family and men, brothers, that were working in the mine. So we're going to be doing that. So everybody, Linda Knoll will be on the show. So that will be Labor Day. We'll be talking about that. So Phyllis, you've got us you're keeping us busy. Thank you. And thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much. It's amazing our little area of the world here, and how much nationally things happened here, because like the Amazon Army March, that's nationally known. So it's pretty interesting, all of the history that we have here.
Well, I can't wait to meet you. As this airs, we would have met you. So that's really cool. Ken, thank you so much for joining us again. Ken's books are on Amazon. It's Ken Peek, and that's Peaka. And the links are in the episode notes. You can get them at the museum, at Miners Hall Museum. Please go to minershallmuseum.com. And also, again, I'll put a link also for the Amazon. So thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Glad to do it.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.